let's let Appian tell us his account of what happened after the Battle of Pharsalus. So Appian says this, quote, "When Pompey saw the rout, he became deranged. He withdrew on foot to his camp, and when he reached his tent, sat there without uttering a word, as they say happened to Telamonian Ajax at the siege of Troy." It's interesting to note, isn't it, how historians always copy each other. You can see the parallels between Appian and Plutarch's accounts. Historians still do it to this day. You'll find one particularly famous history of, say, World War II, like Hugh Trevor Roper or something by A.J.P. Taylor about World War I, or whatever it is. And then many historians later, they're sort of copying, they're sort of paraphrasing another historian. Of course, the problem with that, they're not really doing completely original research. And, well, it's interesting to note, isn't it, that this was done even in the ancient world. So both Plutarch and Appian decide to reference Ajax at that moment. Ajax at the siege of Troy, the victim of heaven-sent madness in the midst of his enemies. As for the rest of his men, Pompey's men, very few entered the camp because Caesar's proclamation caused them to halt without fear. If you remember, Caesar had told Pompey's men on the battlefield, "Stand still, stay where you are, we won't kill you if you just stop. Stay where you are. We're going to butcher all the allies, all the foreign people you've got with you, your auxiliaries and things. But if you're a Roman, a full Roman legionary, just stop where you are, freeze, and we'll let you live." So they've done that. And when their enemies had run past, they scattered group by group. As the day was nearing its end, Caesar ran frantically among his troops, begging them to make a further effort and take Pompey's fortifications too, and pointing out to them that in the event of an enemy recovery, they would be the victors of a single day, but if they took the enemy's camp, they would have settled the campaign by this one exploit. Accordingly, he stretched his hands out in entreaty to them, and was the first to lead the charge. For their part, their limbs were tired, but their spirits were lifted by rational calculation, and by their general's example. Again, Caesar in the forefront. Great stuff. Like Alexander, prepared to risk his own life quite a lot. Remarkable stuff. They were also buoyed up by their success so far, and by the hope that they would take the defences of the camp and capture its considerable contents. And when men are hopeful, or favoured by good fortune, they pay little heed to wariness. So they attacked the camp too, and set about the task with great contempt for the defenders. When Pompey was informed, he only broke his strange silence to exclaim, "So they're at our camp as well?" And with these words, he changed his clothing, took horse with 4 companions, and rode without stopping until he reached Larissa at first light. Caesar, as he had threatened when exhorting his army, spent the whole night within Pompey's fortifications. He himself dined on Pompey's food, and his whole army on that of Pompey's men. So the great feast that Pompey's side had arranged for their victory that evening, Caesar and his men got to dine on that, and they got to spend the night in those really sumptuous tents, those billionaires' tents. Probably a real treat for them, or certainly was a real treat for them, both because they'd spent 10 years in more or less hardship fighting in Gaul, but also in the last few days and weeks particularly had been difficult, hard on Caesar's men. After Dyrrhachium, they were beginning to get starved out. So a real, well-deserved treat for them. Appian goes on. The number of dead on either side, at least of Italians, for no enumeration at all was made of the allies on account of their number and the low regard in which they were held, was 30 centurions and 200, or according to others 1,200, legionaries from Caesar's army, and 10 senators, including Lucius Domitius, who had been appointed Caesar's successor in Gaul, and about 40 distinguished members of the equestrian order from Pompey's. As for the rest of his army, some inflate the casualties and put them at 25,000, but Asinius Pollio, who was one of Caesar's subordinate officers in the battle, records about 6,000 Pompeian dead were found. So they're saying Caesar lost between 200 and 1,200, and Pompey lost something between 6,000 and 25,000. We shall never know the actual numbers. Appian goes on. This was the result of the famous Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar himself carried off from all the palm for bravery, in both first and second place, as everyone agrees, and alongside him the 10th Legion. In third place came Crescinius, a centurion. As Caesar was leaving camp for the battle, he asked Crescinius what he thought would happen, and in a loud voice, Crescinius made the memorable reply, "We shall win, Caesar, and whether I live or die, I shall earn your approval today." The army testified that he had switched from rank to rank like a man possessed, and that his exploits were many and distinguished. When a search was made for him, and he was found among the dead, Caesar adorned his body with the decorations of valour, buried him with them, and made a special tomb for him near the mass grave. If you remember last time I mentioned that one particular centurion who was hell-bent on distinguishing himself in battle and got killed. So Caesar now, after the battle, is honouring him. Appian goes on. Never slackening his pace, Pompey made haste from Larissa to the sea, where, after getting into a small boat, he chanced to meet a ship that was sailing past, which took him to Mytilene. Here he picked up his wife Cornelia and embarked on 4 triremes, which had been sent him by the people of Tyre and Rhodes. He ignored Corcyra once again, and Africa, where he had an intact fleet and another large army, and set off eastwards to the Parthian king in the belief that through him he would win everything back, although he kept his intentions secret until he reluctantly admitted them to his companions when they were in Cilician waters. They told him to beware of the Parthian, who had recently been the target of Crassus's designs and was still furious after this business, and warned him against taking his beautiful wife Cornelia among foreigners who lacked self-control, especially as she had been married to Crassus. That is Crassus's son, not the Crassus. When he proposed as second choices Egypt or Juba, Juba being shorthand for North Africa, they rejected Juba as unworthy and agreed with him on Egypt because it was close and a great kingdom and was still prosperous and strong in ships and food and money, and its rulers, even if they were still children, were friends of Pompey through their father. So mentioned there that Egypt had rulers, plural. So there is the boy king Ptolemy, but he has a co-regent, his sister Cleopatra, the great famous Cleopatra. Dan Carlin describes her as possibly the most famous woman of the ancient world. So she makes her debut in our story now. And if and when I go on to tell the story of Mark Antony and Augustus, which I won't do immediately after this series on Pompey and Caesar, but at some point I would have thought I should do that story in detail. She will crop up there in fantastic detail, but she first rears her actually not all that pretty head at this point. The idea that she looks like a young Liz Taylor is just incorrect. Her image on coins and things doesn't show her to be a great beauty. But anyway, that's beside the point. Appian goes on to say, for these reasons, Pompey sailed to Egypt. Cleopatra, who shared the throne with her brother, had recently been ejected from Egypt and was gathering an army in Syria. Her brother, Ptolemy, was waiting for her attack at Mount Cassius in Egypt, and by some divine chance, the wind caused Pompey to make his landfall there. Seeing a large army on shore, he stopped his ship and, guessing, as was the case, that the king was there, sent a message about himself and mentioned his friendship with the king's father, the previous Ptolemy. Ptolemy himself was about 13, and his guardians were Achillas, who had charge of the army, and the eunuch Pothinus, who had charge of the finances. They arranged a council to discuss what to do about Pompey. One of these present was the rhetorician Theodotus of Samos, the king's tutor, who proposed an evil deed, namely that they should entrap and kill Pompey to win Caesar's gratitude. His view was approved, and a wretched little boat with some of the king's attendants on board was sent out to Pompey, as the water was shallow and difficult for large ships. Sempronius, a Roman who was then serving in the king's army, the Egyptian king's army, but had once been under Pompey's command, delivered greetings from the king to Pompey and told him to take passage across to the boy as to a friend. At the same time as this was going on, the whole army was being drawn up along the beach as if to honour Pompey, and the king could be seen quite plainly in the middle, wearing his purple robes. Pompey was suspicious of everything: the parade of the army, the meanness of the boat, and the fact that the king had neither come to meet him in person nor sent anyone important, recalling to himself these lines from a play by Sophocles: the man who now makes his journey to a despot's court is but the despot's slave, however free he came. He stepped into the boat, became even more suspicious when no one said a word as they made the passage. Whether he recognised Sempronius because the latter was a Roman and had served under him, or whether he guessed it from the fact that he alone was standing up and that it was his military training which forbade him to sit beside a general, he turned to him and said, "Don't I know you, fellow soldier?" Sempronius then nodded assent. But when Pompey turned away, he immediately struck the first blow, and then the others followed his example. He struck Pompey. Can only imagine, it's inferred, with a sword. Pompey's wife and companion, who watched this from a distance, uttered cries of distress and sailed hurriedly away as though they were escaping from an enemy country, stretching out their hands in prayer to the avenging gods of broken truces. Pompey's head was cut off by Pothinus's entourage, who kept it for Caesar in the belief that they would receive an enormous reward, although in fact he took appropriate vengeance on them for their terrible deed. And someone buried the rest of his body on the shore and erected a simple grave on which another hand inscribed, "Rich was this man in temples, but poor now in his tomb." In time, his grave was entirely hidden by sand, but it and the bronze statues of Pompey, later erected at Mount Cassius by his relatives, which had all been defaced and put away in the part of the sanctuary not open to the public, were searched for and found in my time by the Roman Emperor Hadrian when he was visiting Egypt. He cleared Pompey's grave for it to become famous again and restored the images of the man himself. Such then was the end of Pompey's life. He was a man who had brought major wars to an end, had hugely benefited the Roman Empire, and had earned them name the Great as a result. He had never previously lost a battle, but had been undefeated, and attended by the greatest good fortune ever since his youth. Between the ages of 23 and 58, he never ceased to exercise power in autocratic fashion. But because of the contrast with Caesar, he enjoyed the reputation of governing democratically. End quote. So, that is the very ignominious end of Pompey Magnus, murdered by some ex-Roman soldier who used to serve under him, who was currently in the employ of the Egyptian boy king. Just stabbed up, beheaded, and the body left on the beach. Very ignominious. A giant fall from grace. It was only a few days, we don't know the exact timing, maybe a week or two ago, he was on top of the world. He was one of the two most powerful people in the world, in the Roman world. And now he's just a butchered corpse on some Egyptian beach. It's sort of astounding, really. Because as I said a moment ago, it's not necessarily all over. It's quite conceivable. Pompey could have raised another army. He still had control of the seas. His fleet was still sort of all dominant in the Mediterranean. It's far from inconceivable that he could have raised many more armies, faced Caesar again, and won. He had won at Dyrrhachium. He could win. It is possible to beat Caesar, so you can't really expect that Pompey saw that coming, his murder coming. And it is sort of disgraceful or sort of humiliating or embarrassing for the Romans in general, not just the Pompeian faction, but one of their greatest men, definitely one of their greatest men ever, that Rome ever produced, the Roman Republic ever produced, is just murdered like that. Well, there you go. And now I'll let Plutarch finish his life of Pompey. We get a few more details. Right, so Plutarch says this, quote, "It was decided then that they would seek refuge in Egypt. Pompey and his wife set sail in a Seleucian trireme from Cyprus. His companions sailed with him, some in warships like his own, others in merchant ships. He crossed the sea safely, but was then informed that Ptolemy with an army was established at Pelusium and was making war against his sister. Pompey put in at Pelusium and sent on a messenger to tell the king of his arrival and to ask for his protection. Ptolemy himself was a very young man. It was Pothinus who managed everything for him, and Pothinus now called a council of the most influential people. Only those were influential who Pothinus wished to be so," i.e. just saying this Pothinus has got sort of all the power of patronage, more or less all the power of the pharaoh. "A terrible thought indeed, that the fate of Pompey the Great should be left to the discussion of Pothinus the eunuch, Theodotus of Chios, a professional teacher of rhetoric, and Accius the Egyptian. These were the chief counsellors of the king, the rest of the council being made up of court officials and tutors. And it was from this sort of cult that Pompey, tossed at anchor some distance from the shore, was awaiting his verdict. Pompey, who thought it beneath him to have to thank Caesar for saving his life. Different opinions were expressed. Some were for driving Pompey out of the country, others were for inviting him in and welcoming him. Theodotus, however, giving a demonstration of his skill in argument and of his rhetorical prowess, came forward with the view that neither of these courses would be safe for them. If they received Pompey, they would make Caesar their enemy and Pompey their master. If they forced him to leave, they would offend Pompey by the order of expulsion, and Caesar by forcing him to continue his pursuit. The best thing to do, therefore, was to invite the man into the country and then kill him. In this way, they would earn Caesar's gratitude and have nothing to fear from Pompey. He then smiled, and so we are told, added the words, "Dead men don't bite." Well, true enough, but pretty brutal. And even though dead men themselves don't bite, often a murder isn't the end of the story, is it? It's nearly always the beginning of further trials and tribulations. Plutarch goes on. After deciding upon this plan, they entrusted the execution of it to Accius. Accius took with him a man called Septimius, who had once been one of Pompey's centurions, another centurion called Salvius, and 3 or 4 servants. With these he put to sea and sailed towards Pompey's ship. All the most distinguished of those who sailed with Pompey had gone on board this ship to see what was happening. When they saw that instead of there being anything regal or splendid about their reception, or anything to justify the hopeful expectations of Theophanes, there were just a few men sailing towards them in a single fishing boat, they grew suspicious at this apparent lack of respect and advised Pompey to have his ship rowed back into the open sea while they were still out of range from the shore. By this time, however, the boat had drawn near. First Septimius rose to his feet and in Latin saluted Pompey as Imperator. Then Accius greeted him in Greek and invited him to come aboard the boat, saying that in this part there was shallow water for a long distance from the shore, so that, owing to the shoals of sand, the sea was not navigable for a trireme. At the same time, it could be seen that some of the king's ships were being manned and that the whole shore was full of soldiers. Even if they changed their mind, there seemed to be no way of escape, and besides, to show lack of confidence might merely provide the murderers with an excuse for the crime. So Pompey embraced Cornelia, who was weeping and lamenting for him as though he were already dead, and ordered 2 centurions to go into the boat before him, also an ex-slave of his called Philip, and a servant called Scythes. Then, as Accius was already stretching his hand out for him from the boat, he turned to his wife and son, and quoted the verses of Sophocles, "Whoever takes his way into a tyrant's court becomes his slave, although he went there a free man." So once again there, Plutarch and Appian mirroring each other very closely. Still, we get a few more details here in Plutarch. He goes on. These were the last words he spoke to his friends, and after speaking them, he went into the boat. It was some distance from the trireme to the land, and Pompey, seeing that none of the company addressed a single friendly word to him, turned his eyes towards Septimius and said, "Surely I am not mistaken. You and I have been comrades in arms together." Septimius merely nodded his head, saying nothing and giving no sign of friendly feeling. Deep silence fell again, and Pompey took a small notebook in which he had taken down in Greek the speech which he proposed to use in addressing Ptolemy, and began to look through it. As they drew near the shore, Cornelia and his friends watched from the trireme to see what would happen. Cornelia was in a state of terrible anxiety, but she began to take heart when she saw great numbers of the king's people gathering together at the landing place, apparently to give him an honourable reception. But just then, as Pompey took Philip's hand so as to rise up more easily to his feet, Septimius ran him through the body with his sword from behind. Then Salvius and then Accius drew their daggers and stabbed him, and Pompey, drawing his toga down over his face with both hands, endured their blows. He neither said nor did anything unworthy of himself, only groaned a little, and so ended his life in his 60th year, and only 1 day after his birthday. When the people on the trireme saw the murder, they gave such a cry that it could be heard from the shore. Then they hurriedly weighed anchor and took to flight. A strong wind helped them as they ran out to sea, and the Egyptians, though wishing to pursue them, turned back. But they cut off Pompey's head and threw the rest of his body naked out of the boat, leaving it there as a spectacle for those who desired to see such a sight. Philip, however, that's one of Pompey's slaves. Philip, however, stayed by the body until they had had their fill of gazing at it. He then washed it in the seawater and wrapped it in one of his own tunics. Poor Philip, trying to do his best for his slain master. Then, since he had no materials, he searched up and down the coast until he found some broken planks of a small fishing boat, old and decaying, but enough to build a makeshift funeral pyre for a naked and mutilated body. So the Egyptians literally just left the body on the beach. It wasn't enough that they treacherously murdered him, but then and cut off his head, but then just completely discarded it as the body as nothing, as of no value whatsoever. Pretty contemptuous behaviour, to be honest. As he, this slave Philip, as he was collecting the wood and building the pyre, an old man came up who was a Roman and who in his youth had served with Pompey in his first campaigns. "Who are you," he said, "who are preparing the funeral for Pompey the Great?" Philip said that he was Pompey's ex-slave, and the old man said, "But you must not have this honour all to yourself. Let me too share in the pious work now that the chance has come to me. I shall not altogether regret my life in a foreign land if, in return for so many hardships, I find this happiness at last, to touch with my hands and to prepare for burial the body of the greatest imperator that Rome has seen." And so were performed the last rites for Pompey. Next day, Lucius Lentulus, who knew nothing of what had happened, came sailing along the coast on his way from Cyprus and saw a funeral pyre with Philip standing beside it. Before Philip had seen him, he exclaimed, "Who can it be who has ended his days and rests in this place?" Then, after a short pause, he groaned and said, "But it may be you, Pompey the Great." Soon he went ashore, where he was arrested and put to death. So the Egyptians deciding to go as hard as they can in favour of Caesar in this civil war, basically. Right, and so Plutarch sums up his life of Pompey by saying this: "So Pompey came to his end. Not long afterwards, Caesar arrived in Egypt, a country polluted with this foul deed. When one of the Egyptians was sent to him with Pompey's head, he turned away from him with loathing, as from an assassin. And when he received Pompey's signet ring, on which was engraved a lion holding a sword in his paws, he burst into tears. Accius and Pothinus he put to death. King Ptolemy himself, after being defeated in battle on the banks of the Nile, disappeared and was not heard of again. The sophist Theodotus, however, escaped Caesar's vengeance. He fled from Egypt and wandered about, living a wretched life and hated by everyone. But after Marcus Brutus had killed Caesar and came into power, he discovered Theodotus in Asia and put him to death with every possible torture. The ashes of Pompey were taken to Cornelia, who gave them burial at his country house near Alba." End quote.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.